In the calm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Florida, 52-year-old fisherman Charles McCoy had seen just about everything in his 30 years on the water. The waves, the wind, the occasional strange catch, but nothing had ever prepared him for what he found that day. It was a morning like any other. He was out on his boat, casting lines and checking his nets, when something caught his eye. At first he thought it was just debris, maybe a plastic bag or a tangled rope, but as he drew closer, the shape became clearer. Floating just beyond the reach of his boat was an old, weathered doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its clothes were tattered. Something about it didn't sit right with him. His gut told him to pull it up, but when the authorities arrived and saw what was attached to that doll, they turned pale. Would you dare to pull it? Subscribe to find out what happened next. Charles McCoy had been fishing these waters since he was a teenager. Born and raised in Apalachicola, a quiet fishing town nestled along the Gulf Coast of northern Florida, he knew the tides like the back of his weathered hands. At 52, with a thick beard streaked gray and a back slightly bent from years of hauling nets, Charles was a man of few words and steady habits. He owned a modest vessel named the Easy Wind, a trawler he'd inherited from his father, and every morning, rain or shine, he launched before sunrise and returned by dusk. This Thursday morning had started like any other. The ocean was calm, the breeze light, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden shimmer across the water's surface. Charles had already pulled in his first set of traps, mostly mullet and a few blue crabs, when something unusual caught his attention. Off to the starboard side, about 20 feet away, was an object bobbing gently with the rhythm of the sea. He squinted. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of old rags, maybe something that had fallen off a passing boat, or just garbage washed out to sea. But as the waves shifted, light hit the object in a strange way. Too pale, too smooth. It wasn't a rag, it was a face. Charles felt a quick jolt in his chest. He turned the boat slightly to get a better angle and leaned out. There, half submerged in the water, was a porcelain doll. Its eyes were glassy and open, its mouth slightly agape. Its dress was soaked and clung tightly to its thin body, faded from what may have once been a bright pattern into a streaky mess of gray and blue. The strands of hair, synthetic and stringy, were tangled and floated like seaweed around its head. The weirdest part was its position. It didn't float like a piece of plastic or driftwood. It stayed upright, perfectly balanced, as if someone or something below was holding it in place. He frowned. The doll hadn't been there earlier. He was sure of it. He'd passed this stretch just an hour ago. Curiosity took over. He cut the engine and reached for a long pole he kept on board for guiding traps. He extended it out and tried nudging the doll gently. The moment the pole touched it, the doll dipped and spun slightly. Something beneath the surface resisted. Charles felt it, a faint tug. The doll wasn't just floating. It was tethered to something below. He stood still, letting the water calm. His breath caught in his throat. The pole was still in contact with the doll, and he slowly applied pressure, trying to lift it. The resistance increased. It was connected to something submerged, something heavy. A part of him wanted to just let it go, chalk it up to another oddity of the sea and move on. But that gut feeling, that weird itch in the back of his neck, wouldn't let him. He reached for a gaff hook. With a slow, careful motion, he snagged the fabric of the doll's dress and began pulling it toward the boat. Inch by inch, it came closer, water trailing off in slow, deliberate drips. Then, with a soft thump, he dropped it onto the deck. It was even more unsettling up close. The porcelain was cracked in spiderweb patterns, and one of its glass eyes was missing. There was a small tag sewn into the hem of the dress, but the letters were too faded to read clearly. But the most disturbing part was the fishing line. Thin, almost invisible, looped tightly around its waist. The line extended back over the side of the boat, taut as a piano wire. Whatever was on the other end, it was still in the water. Charles crouched beside the doll, his rough fingers brushing the porcelain. Cold, not just from the sea, almost unnaturally cold. He couldn't explain it. He stood and looked out over the water again. The line disappeared into the deep. He grabbed a glove, then reached for the line and gave it a pull. It didn't move. He wrapped it around the pole and tried again. Still nothing. He considered cutting it. Maybe it was just snagged on something. But instinct told him this was something different. He secured the line to a cleat and started the engine. Gently, he gave the boat a bit of throttle, letting it drift and pull the line slowly. Nothing. Then a sudden jerk. The line snapped tight. The boat rocked. Charles stumbled but held steady. Something down there had moved. He turned off the engine again, listening. The only sounds were the waves lapping against the hull and the gulls circling above. He peered over the side and saw nothing but murky green. He needed help. Pulling out his old Nokia, weatherproof, indestructible, he called his friend Ray Lambert, another local fisherman and longtime companion. Ray was dependable, level-headed. Charles knew he wouldn't laugh. Ray picked up after 2 rings. "You out on the bay?" "Yeah," Charles said. "Near Reed Shoal. Listen, I found something weird." "What kind of weird?" "A doll, floating. But it's tied to something underwater, and I can't move it." There was silence on the other end. "A doll?" Ray finally said. "Yeah, it's not right. You gotta see it." Ray agreed to come out. He was 30 minutes away. As Charles waited, he sat on the deck, staring at the doll. The longer he looked, the stranger it seemed. Its arms were jointed, movable, like antique craftsmanship. But there were tiny etchings along its back, symbols, maybe letters, that didn't look like anything he recognized. Then came the smell. Faint at first, metallic, sour, like rusted iron and something rotten. It hadn't been there before. It drifted up from the water, thin as a whisper. Charles stood, suddenly tense. He scanned the sea, the sky. Nothing. Everything looked the same. But the feeling in his gut had shifted, from curiosity to something darker. He reached again for the fishing line and gave it one more pull. This time, something moved. The line slackened for a moment, then went taut again. Something beneath the surface was shifting, slowly, deliberately. He looked over the edge and saw bubbles, small ones rising steadily. Then a second line surfaced, floating beside the first. It hadn't been there before. He hadn't touched it, but now it drifted toward his boat, as if reaching. Before he could react, Ray's boat came into view on the horizon. Relief flooded Charles's chest. Ray pulled up alongside and tied his boat to the easy wind. He climbed aboard, his sun-weathered face squinting in suspicion. "You weren't kidding," Ray muttered as he looked down at the doll. "Nope, that line's connected to something under us. Won't budge." Ray crouched beside the doll, frowning. "Looks handmade. Old. Real old." Charles nodded. "And there's another line. Just surfaced." They both stared at the water. The new line floated like a serpent, twisting lazily in the current. Ray grabbed a boat hook and snagged it. He began pulling it toward them. It wasn't tied to anything, just floating. But as he hauled it in, something clunked against the hull from below. Charles froze. Ray leaned over and looked down. His face went pale. "There's a crate," he whispered. "I think it's a box. Wood, but it's shaped strange." They exchanged glances. Neither of them wanted to go in the water. Ray nodded. "We need someone with gear. This is too much." Charles agreed. They both took a few steps back from the doll. The smell was stronger now. The air itself felt heavier. They called the Coast Guard, and as they waited, both men sat in silence, watching the water, watching the doll, and neither of them noticed until much later that the doll had moved slightly, just a tilt of the head, just enough to face the boat's cabin, but neither of them had touched it. What would you do if you saw something like this floating in the ocean? Would you pull it up or let it go? Let us know in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true unsolved mysteries, and tap the bell so you never miss a single strange tale from the sea. As Charles and Ray waited, the atmosphere around them seemed to thicken with anticipation. The water, once calm, now rippled and churned subtly beneath their boats. No one said it, but both men felt it, a palpable, growing unease. The doll, still laying on the deck of the easy wind, seemed almost expectant. The lines still trailed off into the water, invisible beneath the surface, and the crate, still submerged, seemed to be drawing them in with an eerie pull. The minutes stretched. No one spoke, except for occasional mutterings of frustration, as they waited for the Coast Guard's response. Charles kept his eyes fixed on the water, and Ray was looking over the side of the boat, scanning the surface. They both knew the Coast Guard was a good hour away at least, and neither of them could shake the feeling that time was running out, that something was waiting beneath the surface. Ray tugged at the fishing line again, with a hard yank. The movement beneath the water was unmistakable. A large object was resisting, something heavy. The line tugged back, firm and steady. "Ray, this doesn't feel right. We should have waited for backup," Charles muttered, his voice tense. "I know, but it's too late now," Ray replied, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cool breeze. "We've already touched it. Whatever's down there is ours now. You don't leave stuff like that out here." Charles nodded, but his gut was still tight with doubt. His instincts had rarely let him down on the water, but this time they were screaming at him to turn around and leave. Still, he could hear the low hum of the Coast Guard's engines in the distance now. The relief was almost palpable. At least they wouldn't be alone in whatever was coming next. As the two boats floated in silence, a soft fog began to roll in, thickening quickly. It wasn't typical for this time of year, but it made everything feel more disorienting. The quiet was broken only by the distant calls of seagulls and the faint hum of the Coast Guard's boat getting closer. Ray kept an eye on the water, but Charles couldn't help glancing at the doll again. It was almost as if the thing was alive. He shivered despite himself. Then, just as he was about to speak, the Coast Guard boat arrived. The small patrol vessel sliced through the water, its lights flashing, cutting through the fog like a blade. The men on board were well equipped, ready for any emergency. They had seen all sorts of things: wreckage, dead fish, and even occasionally a body or two from one of the deeper, more dangerous parts of the Gulf. But as the Coast Guard crew stepped aboard the Easy Wind, they immediately stopped, stunned by the sight of the doll. "Is this what you called us out for?" one of them, a young officer named Brian, asked, his voice filled with disbelief. He stared at the doll, then at the lines trailing over the side. "This isn't just a doll," Charles said, his voice tight. "It's connected to something. You have to pull it up." Ray pointed toward the water, his eyes wide. "There's something down there. A box, maybe a crate. We can't move it. It's like it's stuck." Officer Brian nodded, looking back at his superior, Lieutenant Wells. The lieutenant was older, more seasoned. He stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. He crossed his arms and seemed to consider it for a moment. "Let's get some diving gear," Wells said calmly. "We're not pulling anything until we know what it is." The Coast Guard crew quickly set to work. They lowered a diving team into the water, gearing up with wetsuits and oxygen tanks. The tension was palpable. Each diver could feel the weight of what lay beneath, though no one spoke it aloud. Meanwhile, Charles and Ray remained on the boat, watching nervously. The only sounds were the creaking of the boat, the distant sloshing of water, and the faint sound of the divers' movements below. The minutes dragged on as the divers circled below, but nothing surfaced. Charles looked to Ray, then back at the doll. "Something doesn't feel right, Ray," Charles muttered. "It's like we shouldn't be messing with this thing." Ray's expression was grim. "I know, but we've already started. Whatever's down there, it's not just going to go away." A soft splash echoed from below, and one of the divers surfaced. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Lieutenant, you need to come down here, now." Wells immediately climbed over the side of the boat, descending onto the platform to talk with the diver. They exchanged a few hushed words, but whatever they said, it made the lieutenant's face grow more solemn. Wells motioned for Charles and Ray to come over. They did cautiously, their nerves fraying. "Listen carefully," Wells began. "What's down there isn't a crate like you thought. It's a sealed metal box. It's buried about 10 feet below the surface." Ray's eyes widened. "A metal box?" "Yeah," Wells continued. "And the doll? It's tied to it somehow. The lines, they're anchored to the box, which is locked tight. We're going to need equipment to get it out." Charles swallowed. "What's inside it?" Wells hesitated. "We're not sure yet, but it's heavy. It's definitely been down there for a long time." Charles glanced at the doll again. The porcelain face seemed to stare back, unnervingly. "We need to get it out," Wells said with finality. "And we'll need a full team. This is going to take some time, but we're not leaving here without answers." The divers began working again, carefully assessing the submerged box, using a winch to try and pull it free. Time passed slowly as the crew focused on the task at hand. Charles and Ray remained on edge, the tension mounting with each passing minute. Then, after what felt like hours, the box was finally free. The divers emerged, hauling it slowly toward the boat, accompanied by a strange metallic screech as it scraped against the hull. The weight of it was astonishing. It had to have been enormous when it was first lowered into the water. The doll, still sitting on the deck, seemed to watch the crew work. Its cracked eyes locked on the now revealed box. Once the box was on board, Wells immediately gave the order to seal it. No one wanted to take any chances. As the crew took turns trying to pry the box open, Charles stood at the edge of the boat, staring at the water, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside, it was something far beyond a simple mystery. And then it happened. The box gave way with a groan. The lid creaked open, and a cloud of silt erupted from within. Something dark, something large, began to emerge. But the real shock came when the object fully surfaced. A large rusted metal cylinder covered in barnacles and marine growth was inside the box. It looked like a capsule, something ancient, something that shouldn't be there. This is... What the hell is this? Ray whispered, staring at the object. Charles had no answer. Wells stared at the cylinder, his expression unreadable. He turned back to the divers. Get it out of the water now. We're not messing around with this. But as the divers struggled to lift the object, the sea began to stir once more, as if reacting to the disturbance. A wave rolled beneath the easy wind, causing the boat to pitch sharply. Charles looked up sharply. The doll was gone. It had vanished. Would you have dared to pull the doll out of the water? Or would you have left it untouched? What do you think was inside that mysterious metal capsule? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you want more strange stories like this, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an update. What could possibly be the secret behind this bizarre discovery? We want to hear your theories. The doll had vanished. One moment it had been there, watching with its single glass eye, and the next, it was simply gone. Neither Ray nor Charles had touched it. No one on the Coast Guard vessel had moved it, yet the space where it had rested on the deck of the Easy Wind was now empty, damp with seawater, but otherwise unremarkable. What the hell? Ray muttered, scanning the deck in disbelief. Charles took 2 steps forward, looking around as though it might have rolled behind the crate or slipped off the side. But it was gone. No splash, no sound, just gone. Lieutenant Wells hadn't seen it disappear, but when he saw the look on the fishermen's faces and noticed the vacant spot where the doll had been, he knew something wasn't right. It didn't fall, Charles said, voice low. It didn't move. It just vanished. Wells narrowed his eyes, turning his attention back to the cylinder now laying on the boat deck like a slumbering beast. Barnacles clung to its sides and faint ridges lined the surface. It looked far older than anything any of them had expected to find. He signaled to Officer Brian, who had just finished photographing the artifact. Get the lab team on this. We need a mobile analysis. And call the FBI if you have to. I want someone down here with historical clearance. Brian hesitated. You think this is government? Wells didn't answer directly. Instead, he crouched beside the cylinder. His fingers brushed over the ridges, scraping off algae to reveal a strange pattern beneath. Markings, etched deeply into the metal. They weren't in English. They didn't look like any language Wells recognized. And they weren't just symbols. They were carved with such precision that it gave the impression of being etched by machine, or something else. This wasn't dumped here, he muttered. It was placed. One of the divers, still drying off on the Coast Guard boat, looked over. There's more down there, he said quietly. Wells stood. More what? More like this. Not exactly the same shape, but I saw outlines. Maybe buried deeper. Boxes, shapes, things that don't belong. For a moment, everyone on board was silent. Charles and Ray exchanged glances. They were fishermen, practical men. But even they could see that this was no ordinary sunken crate. What do you think it is? Charles asked. Wells didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the cylinder, the intricate markings shimmering faintly under the light. He ran a hand through his hair, then stood up straighter. Let's get it secured. We're not opening it here. He barked orders. The crew worked quickly, hoisting the cylinder onto a support brace. The deck groaned under its weight. Despite being hollow, it was as heavy as stone. 2 officers wrapped it in padded straps, and the team began prepping for transport. Still, something gnawed at Charles. The doll, he said suddenly, louder this time. That doll was tied to this thing. It wasn't random. It was meant to mark it, or guard it. Ray nodded slowly. Like a warning? Or a bait, Charles added, to get someone to pull it up. Lieutenant Wells didn't answer, but his expression darkened. As the team finished preparing the artifact, Charles turned back to the edge of the boat. The fog had lifted slightly, but the water remained still and oddly opaque. It wasn't the water he was used to. It felt heavier and colder. Then something clicked in his memory. Years ago, his grandfather had told him stories, tall tales about shipwrecks and strange happenings off the coast. Most were nonsense, legends passed between fishermen. But there was one tale Charles remembered with sudden clarity. It was about a ship, a research vessel, that vanished in the 1940s near this very stretch of coast. Some said it had been carrying experimental technology. Others whispered it was part of a secret military operation. The wreck had never been found, just gone, like it never existed. Until now, he hesitated, then walked over to Wells. "You ever hear of the Aegir Dawn?" Charles asked. Wells gave him a look. "World War II era science vessel? Disappeared off the map in '44? Charles nodded. "My grandfather said it sank out here. Said the Navy never confirmed it, but locals used to see strange lights over the water." Ray added, "They used to say the area near Reed Shoal was cursed. People avoided it for decades. And then, we just forgot." Wells looked back at the artifact, then back at the men. "Get this thing wrapped up now," he ordered sharply. "We're heading to shore. I want this in a secured facility before nightfall." As the boats turned toward land, Charles couldn't stop looking back. The water seemed to watch him. The place where the doll had been tied now sat quiet, but something told him that this wasn't over. Whatever they had pulled up, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. Back at the docks in Apalachicola, a small crowd had begun to gather. Word spreads fast in small towns, and by the time the Coast Guard arrived, dozens of locals were waiting, peering over the edge, hoping to catch a glimpse. Wells and his team quickly secured the cylinder and transported it to a temporary holding station. But as they were unloading the object, something unexpected happened. The outer layer of algae and barnacles began to slough off, almost like the metal was rejecting the marine buildup. The markings grew brighter, as if reacting to air. No one dared touch it without gloves, but the eerie transformation was clear to all. The mobile science team arrived by evening. They set up scanners and devices, beginning a series of non-invasive tests. The results were baffling. The metal wasn't identifiable. It wasn't steel, aluminum, or titanium. It wasn't even from any known alloy. And stranger still, it wasn't corroded. There were no signs of oxidation, despite being underwater for what could have been decades, or even longer. As the scientists huddled and whispered theories, one of the lab techs scanned the surface for heat signatures. The monitor blinked. A single line of internal warmth ran through the center, like a faint heartbeat. Something inside was still active. By midnight, the room had grown silent. Wells stood over the artifact, arms crossed. Charles and Ray had stayed behind, unable to walk away. They watched the scientists work, watched the flickers of confusion on their faces. Then, one of the younger technicians gasped, "Sir, there's something moving inside." The room froze. Wells approached the screen. "Repeat that." The technician turned the monitor toward him. The thermal imaging now showed faint shifting heat signatures, like something stirring inside the capsule. "It's not just an object," the technician said slowly. "It's alive." No one breathed. Wells stepped back. "Shut it down. Power everything off." The team obeyed immediately. The lights dimmed, the humming stopped, and the room plunged into an eerie silence broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. And then, faintly from inside the capsule, came a sound. A slow, deliberate tapping. 3 knocks. Then silence. Charles felt his heart skip a beat. Everyone stared at the object. No one moved. No one even whispered. Finally, Wells spoke. "We seal this up. No one opens it until we get a government clearance." But deep inside, everyone knew something had already changed. Something had been disturbed, and there would be no sealing it back completely. Later that night, as Charles sat in his truck overlooking the dock, he thought about the doll. Where had it gone? Why had it been tied to the capsule? And, most of all, was it part of whatever was now awake? Would you open the capsule if you were in their place? Or would you let it stay sealed forever? Let us know in the comments what you think is inside this artifact, and what the doll really meant. And if you want to see what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe now, so you don't miss the next chapter in this strange, unfolding mystery. What do you believe this ancient capsule really holds? The air was thick with unease, even as the hours passed. The small holding facility at the docks in Apalachicola was unusually quiet. The once bustling port town had fallen into a strange stillness, the normal sounds of fishermen loading their boats and the occasional hum of traffic fading into an eerie calm. The only movement came from the research team, hunched over the strange artifact in the back room, their faces illuminated by flickering screens and dim overhead lights. Charles sat in the waiting area, his eyes fixed on the door that led into the facility. Ray was next to him, occasionally shifting in his seat, his gaze just as restless. Both men knew something had changed the moment they'd pulled that capsule out of the water. But now, as they waited, it felt like the entire world had stopped. "Do you think it's really alive?" Ray finally asked, his voice low, almost as if speaking too loudly would make the air crack under the weight of the question. Charles didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hands over his face. "I don't know, Ray, but I've been fishing these waters for decades. I've seen a lot of weird things. But this is different. It doesn't feel like something that's just natural. Something about it, it's been waiting." Ray swallowed hard, glancing over at the closed door. "Waiting for what?" Charles shook his head. "Hell if I know. But whatever it is, we've disturbed it now." They both fell silent again, lost in thought. The faint hum of the facility's cooling system was the only sound breaking the silence between them. Every minute that ticked by only deepened the tension. Around midnight, Wells finally emerged from the back room. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed. He walked over to Charles and Ray, his expression serious, bordering on grave. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." Charles stood immediately, his gut tight with anxiety. He exchanged a look with Ray, then followed Wells down the narrow hallway to the back room, the sound of their footsteps echoing faintly off the walls. Inside, the lab was lit only by the glow of several monitors. The capsule sat in the center of the room, still wrapped in padded straps, but the air around it felt heavy. It was as though the object itself exuded a quiet, persistent energy. Wells motioned toward the table. "We ran some preliminary scans, and we started hearing sounds." Charles frowned. "What kind of sounds?" Ray stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the capsule. "Like taps? That kind of sound?" Wells nodded, his jaw tight. "Exactly. But what's worse, the tapping wasn't just a coincidence. We've traced it to a specific point inside. There's something in there, or something that was in there." Charles crossed the room slowly, standing over the artifact. It looked more ominous in the dim light, the barnacles now peeling away as if some hidden force was working on the surface. The metal had shifted slightly in appearance, almost as if it were growing. He glanced over at Wells, his suspicion growing. "What are you saying exactly?" Wells took a deep breath. "There's a series of codes in the metal, like a sequence. We ran an algorithm over it, and it came up with something, a set of coordinates. They're not local, though. They're international." Ray raised an eyebrow. "International coordinates? For what?" "I don't know," Wells admitted. "But the coordinates don't point to any known location. The closest match is an old abandoned research base way up in the Arctic. That's where this thing, I think it came from." Charles stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "The Arctic? What the hell was a capsule doing buried in the Gulf with coordinates leading to a research base in the frozen north? How the hell do you explain that?" he muttered. Wells wasn't done. "There's more." Charles turned back. "More? What could be more than that?" Wells motioned to the monitor, which now displayed a map of the Arctic Circle. A glowing red dot blinked over a remote location. "The tapping inside the capsule," Wells said. "It's not random. We've been recording it, at regular intervals. It matches the pattern of the coordinates. And if that wasn't enough, the tapping started getting faster after we opened it." Charles's heart raced. "Faster?" "Exactly," Wells confirmed. "Like it's reacting to being exposed, like it's trying to wake up. And whatever's inside, it doesn't want to be here." The words hit Charles like a cold wave. There was something inside the capsule, something that didn't want to be found, something alive, or something that had been alive, and now it was waking up. Ray looked uneasy. "And the doll? What does it have to do with all this? Why was it tied to the capsule?" Wells glanced at the capsule, his brow furrowed. "I'm not sure yet, but I think it's connected somehow. The doll was a marker, a signal. Maybe it was meant to draw someone in. And the line, what if the doll was supposed to be a key? Maybe it wasn't just tied for decoration. Maybe it was a way to unlock whatever was inside. A chill ran down Charles's spine. His mind raced with questions. Who had placed this capsule here and why? Why the Gulf of Mexico? Why the doll? And who, or what, had been waiting to be released? There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't just some abandoned research relic. Whatever it was important, and it wasn't meant to be found. Suddenly there was another noise, a faint rhythmic tapping, almost like a heartbeat. Charles froze. That's different, he said. It's coming from the inside. Wells stepped forward, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. We have to figure this out. We need to open it fully, see what's inside. If we don't... Before he could finish, a loud crack echoed through the room, followed by a sharp metallic groan. The capsule shuddered violently. Everyone took a step back. The sound grew louder, growing more frantic. The tapping turned into something else. A screech, a grinding noise. Charles's heart raced. The capsule was vibrating now, its markings glowing faintly in the low light. It was as if something was trying to push its way out. The air in the room thickened, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the walls were closing in. "Shut it down!" Wells yelled, but it was too late. There was another crack, followed by a snap, and then the capsule exploded open with a deafening noise. Everyone ducked as fragments of metal, glass, and barnacles flew across the room. The force of the blast knocked several of the lab's equipment onto the floor, and the researchers scrambled for cover. Charles and Ray were thrown back into the wall, but the moment the dust cleared, they stood up, their eyes locked on the object now emerging from the wreckage of the capsule. A shape was slowly unfolding, a long, dark figure, almost like a shadow given form, stretching into a humanoid shape. Its body glimmered faintly, shimmering like something metallic, and its outline seemed to flicker in and out of existence. And then, from somewhere deep within, came a voice, a low, resonant hum, so deep it felt like it came from the earth itself. It was alive. Charles stepped forward, his heart in his throat. He could feel it. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some artifact. It was sentient. And now, it was free. The researchers were frozen, unable to move, staring at the figure that was now fully revealed. What had they unleashed? As the figure's form became clearer, Charles couldn't help but wonder, what kind of ancient intelligence had they just awakened? And more importantly, was it dangerous? What do you think? Was this figure a product of an ancient civilization, or something even older? And what was its purpose? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and hit that like button if you want to see more of this mystery unfold. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. What do you think this is, and where did it come from? The room held its breath. No one moved. Not the scientists, not the fishermen, not even Lieutenant Wells, who'd faced more crises than he could count during his years in uniform. But this was unlike anything they'd prepared for. The figure that had emerged from the capsule stood motionless at first. Its form was unsettling, not grotesque, but unreal. Vaguely human in shape, but its skin shimmered with a texture that shifted between liquid metal and stone. Eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly with an inner blue light, as though backlit by some energy source deeper than bone. And when it finally did move, it did so without sound. Not a step, not a breath, just presence. Then it looked directly at Charles. The eye contact sent a spike of electricity down his spine. His legs froze, heart pounding in his ears. He felt seen, not just looked at. It was as if this being could read every memory, every mistake, every moment of his life, and weigh it all in an instant. The hum returned, but this time it carried with it something more. Images, not words, not thoughts. Visions, not flashing inside Charles's mind like a dream underwater. Symbols, ships in ice, maps scorched into parchment, fire that burned without flames, a face that wasn't a face, and a circle, always the same circle, drawn into the snow. Charles stumbled back, gasping. Wells caught him. What happened? What did it do? Charles shook his head. It didn't speak, but I saw things. Old things. Places I've never been. Names I've never heard. It showed me. He looked over at Ray, whose face was pale. Did you see it too? Ray nodded slowly. I saw a warning. The figure took another step forward. Not menacing, not threatening, but with purpose. Suddenly, all the monitors in the lab flickered and went dark. Every machine powered down. The emergency backup lights kicked in, casting the room in a deep red hue. Then came the sound, distant, echoing, but very real. A rumble from somewhere beneath the town. "What is that?" Wells muttered. The floor trembled slightly, just enough for everyone to feel it. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was geological. The being turned its gaze downward, then back to Charles. Again, the hum. This time Charles heard a single word in his mind, so clearly it was as if someone had whispered it into his ear. "Return." He blinked. Return? What? But the being had already stepped back toward the remains of the capsule. The cracked shell that once held it now looked like nothing more than ancient armor, discarded after centuries of disuse. Then, without warning, it stepped into the shattered remains and disappeared. Not vanished in a flash, not through a trapdoor or tunnel. It was as though space itself folded inward, closing like water over a stone. One moment it was there, and the next, the capsule was empty, silent. The hum ceased. The tremors stopped. The lights flickered back on. And just like that, it was gone. For a full minute, no one spoke. Then Ray said what they were all thinking. "Did we just send it back?" Lieutenant Wells didn't answer. He walked to the capsule, looked inside again, and then back at his team. "Shut this facility down. I want everything sealed, scanned, and locked under federal authority. Now." Charles sat down, finally exhaling. That wasn't human, was it? Ray leaned on the counter beside him. Not even close. The scientists started packing. Gear was unplugged, boxes sealed. Within an hour, the makeshift lab had been cleared, and the capsule loaded onto a reinforced trailer under armed guard. The plan was simple. It would be transported to a secure facility in Virginia under classified designation. But Charles had a feeling the story wasn't over. A week later, a quiet federal crew returned to the waters near Reed Shoal. They deployed sonar, drones, and divers. What they found was beyond explanation. Beneath the seabed, at over 200 feet, were a series of metallic structures, spheres, tubes, and long serpentine frames, all buried under layers of silt and stone. None of it matched any known material or design, and most of it hadn't been there a month ago. They ran tests, samples. Nothing made sense. The official report filed by Lieutenant Wells read simply, "Unknown submerged architecture, possible Cold War relic. Further investigation pending." But Charles knew better, and then came the final twist. 2 weeks after the incident, Charles returned to his boat, hoping to find some sense of normalcy again. The ocean had always given him peace, but when he stepped onto the easy wind, he saw it immediately. There, resting on the bench where he always sat for lunch, was the doll. Dry, clean, its single glass eye restored, and tied around its waist was a new line. He stared at it for a long time. His hands trembled. He didn't touch it, not this time. Instead, he climbed off the boat, locked the cabin, and walked back to shore. He never fished again. Some say the ocean hides its secrets well. Others say it only lends them briefly to those willing to pull hard enough. But one thing's for sure, something ancient, something waiting was beneath those waters, and it had only just stirred. And you? What do you think that being was? An alien, a traveler, a guardian, or something far older than we can even imagine? Would you have pulled that doll from the water? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your theories. And if you enjoyed this true tale of mystery, suspense, and the unknown, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another chilling story from the edge of the unexplained. Because out there, somewhere, beneath the waves, something is still watching.